So I think we should get rolling. Welcome, everybody. Pleased to have everybody here for this presentation by the Irvington Historical Society. I'd like to, as we start, I'd like to introduce Pat Ryan, who is the current president of the Historical Society. She, I think, wants to say a few words of welcome. Pat, I'm going to unmute you right now.
Okay. Thanks, Chet, and thanks to all of you for joining our first Zoom talk. Chet will start in a minute, but first I wanted to say a few words about the Historical Society's most recent project, Portrait of a Village in a Time of Crisis, Irvington 2020. We are seeking your help in recording the extraordinary circumstances we are living through as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Please send personal reflections, stories, and photos that express your response to the crisis. The Society will collect, compile, and preserve your submissions as part of our mission to chronicle the history of the village. To see some of the responses that we've already received, just go to irvingtonhistoricalsociety.org. And to share your thoughts and recollections, just click on the Tell Us Your Story button. Thanks, and hoping to hear from you. And now, a few words about our speaker. Chet Kerr and his wife, Heather Thomas, have lived in Irvington for 23 years. After practicing law in New York City for over 30 years, Chet left his firm in 2016 to do new and different things. He currently teaches, works on civil rights issues and criminal justice reform, leads the Pollinator Project, and serves on several boards, including the Greater Irvington Land Trust, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, and to our great benefit today, the Irvington Historical Society. So now I'll turn it over to you, Chet.
Thanks, Pat. Let me just mute you again. One second, everybody. Okay, so welcome everybody. I'm pleased you're all here. The way this talk's going to go, I am going to go through a presentation about the history of the founding of Irvington. And we're going to have questions and answers at the end. I can explain to you how that will all be done. But for the moment, why don't we walk through and save your questions to the end. So we're going to start off with, this is a map, which I will talk a little bit about. It was done in 1850, right when the original village, which was then known as Dearman, was being created. And our talk today is about the events leading up to this creation, and then after, about the 10-year period afterwards. So in his 1866 book, The Hudson, Benson Lossing wrote this: "Close by Sunnyside is one of those marvelous villages with which America abounds. It has sprung up like a mushroom and bears the name of Irvington in compliment to the late master of Sunnyside. A dozen years ago, not a solitary house was there excepting that of Mr. Dearman, the farmer who owned the land. This all seems like a work of magic." And I think that quote kind of exemplifies what we're going to talk about today and how our village was kind of created out of whole cloth, out of a vision that several people had of what could be done along this side of the Hudson. And, you know, over the course of 10 short years, the open pastures of Mr. Dearman's farm became a thriving 600-person community of homes, small businesses, and industry. And this story is a mixture of hard work, perseverance, and I think just luck. And that's kind of what made it all work. We want to go back now to the beginning, however, and this, for those of you who come to some of my talks before, you're probably familiar with this map. This was a map that was put together for the commissioners of forfeiture, who were appointed right after the Revolutionary War to sell the seized land of Phillipsburg Manor. That was the property up and down the east side of the Hudson that had been owned by Frederick Phillips, who was a loyalist to the British government. It was seized by the New York state government, and after the war, sold off to various tenant farmers who had been working the land prior to the war. And this map, and this is actually a 1785 map that was redrawn in 1880. So it shows some of the features, later features, that weren't there. And you'll see right in the middle, there is a large 215-acre part, which is reference to William Dutcher, but it's actually William Dutcher. And you'll see on the left, the kind of a street as where, and that is where Irvington, as we know it today, was created as part of the Dutcher farm. South of Dutcher's farm was the farm of John Jewell, who was also another tenant farmer and purchased his land after the Revolutionary War. And just above the Dutcher farm was the farm of Abraham Acker, who also purchased his land just after the Revolutionary War. This was sold to William Dutcher, and he then died in 1795, and it was left to distribute among his 5 sons. In 1806, 4 of his sons decided to convey their interest in the property to William Dutcher Jr., and that is the person who owned the property starting from about 1806 through almost to the point of the creation of Irvington. In the April of 1812, Justus Dearman, who was another farmer in Phillipsburg in the area of the Hudson, purchased the southern half of the Dutcher farm, consisting of about 144 acres, and extended from the Hudson River to almost the Sawmill River. Dearman was a farmer who has been described by some contemporary folks as a man of the land. Interestingly, in May of 1812, a month after he purchased this farm, he entered into an agreement with William Dutcher, who still owned the northern half of the farm, to allow Dearman to expand the existing dock on the Hudson River at the southern edge of the Dutcher property. And that dock gave both Justus Dearman and William Dutcher access to the growing trade along the Hudson River. And what we'll hear is that's an interesting prelude to the development of this whole region as people moved in and commerce was created, and that was in certain ways the driver behind what was led to the creation of Irvington. So along the eastern shore of the Hudson River in the early 1800s, it was fairly empty. In June of 1835, Washington Irving, the author Washington Irving, purchased his home at Sunnyside, which for most of you who know, that is just north of Sunnyside Lane, West Sunnyside Lane today. It's actually in the boundaries of Tarrytown, but it was kind of the northern boundary of what is Irvington today. 2 months earlier, in April of 1835, James Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton's son, had purchased a 203-acre estate along the Hudson River, about a mile south of Sunnyside. And these two estates kind of sandwich what we think of today as the main part of Irvington. And at the time, the surrounding area remained largely open farmland, just as it had been at the close of the Revolutionary War. Travel from New York City was either by steamboat up the Hudson River or by carriage on the Highland Turnpike that ran from Kingsbridge in the Bronx up the east side of the river toward Albany. And that is today Broadway as we know it, as it runs through Irvington. And the land along the river was mostly open pastures and fields with few, if any, trees. In fact, contemporary authors indicate that there were almost no trees in this part of the Hudson, and it was kind of open, spectacular, wide open farmland. To talk about the growth of Irvington, however, we have to actually switch to the other side of the river momentarily to hear a little bit about what was going on the west side of the Hudson River, because it had an impact on what led to the development of Irvington. With the completion of the Erie Canal, which went from Lake Erie up across the northern part of New York to Albany in 1825, New York business leaders began investigating other transportation routes through the southern tier of counties in western New York. And in 1832, the New York State Legislature granted a charter to the New York and Erie Railroad, giving it the power to construct a single, double, or treble railroad or way commencing at the city of New York, or at such point in its vicinity as shall be most eligible and convenient therefore, and continue said railroad through the southern tier of counties to the shore of Lake Erie. And the vision was to create a more immediate direct pathway from New York City through the southern part of New York up to Lake Erie. There was a lot of distrust among different regions of the state as to who was going to get what resources for this, and whether or not it was simply an effort by some developers in Pennsylvania, New Jersey to expand their empire. So the original charter prohibited a connection with any railroad leading from Pennsylvania or New Jersey, which meant that it had to go straight from the Hudson River across the southern part of New York without touching Pennsylvania or New Jersey. In 1833, the New York legislature reduced the amount of initial capital required, and that allowed the railroad to be formed, and it was then organized by a man named Eleazar Ford as its president. And I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that quite right. Eleazar Ford was an author, an educator, a businessman, and he was a founder of the Manhattan Fire Insurance Company of New York. And in 1835, the New York and Erie Railroad mandated that its eastern terminus, the terminus on the Hudson River, should be a pier at what was then known as Tatton Slope, where ferries transporting passengers and freight from New York City could dock. That was the plan. In about 1838, the railroad built from Tappan Slope a peninsula out into the river of about a mile. And the president of the railroad, Eleazar Ford, decided that Tatton Slope and its mile-long pier should be renamed Piermont. And that is where Piermont is today. And that was the original eastern terminus for the Erie Railroad. Now, Lord built a 30-room Gothic castle on the hill above the Piermont Pier. And he quickly became friends with Washington Irving, who lived across the river at Sunnyside. And they would visit each other by taking small boats across from Sunnyside back to Piermont and back and forth. The railroad began operations between Piermont and Goshen in 1841, and then extended its operations from Piermont all the way to Lake Erie. So this allowed ferries to bring passengers and freight up the Hudson River from New York City, dock at this pier at Piermont. Trains would come right out to the very edge of the pier, and then they could travel by train all the way to Lake Erie to western New York. And once they get into Lake Erie, they'd be able to then traverse through the Great Lakes, ultimately to Mississippi River and beyond all that. And that was a tremendous entree into the western part of the United States. That was the plan. Now, with the arrival of the New York and Erie Railroad in Rockland County and the expansion of commerce up and down the Hudson River, multiple ferry companies competed for traffic up and down the river. In addition, numerous franchises were granted to individuals to run ferries between the Rockland and Westchester shores. And in early 1849, the New York legislature passed an act to authorize Benjamin James and James Schultz to establish and continue a ferry across the Hudson River from Piermont to the opposite shore in the county of Westchester. Well, the opposite shore in the county of Westchester from the Piermont Pier was Justus Dearman's dock, the very dock that he got authorization back in 1812 to expand and build with William Dutcher. And that's kind of made this connection between this railway and expansion out west directly across the river to where Irvington is today. Now, this is a map of what the New York and Erie Railroad's grand scheme was for how it would traverse from the very western part into Rockland County and then have these various entrance points onto the river. And the very southern one, right below that, you'll see slowed on the map, that was the train track that went to Piermont, out onto the long pier that extended out and where ferries would come up from New York City. Now, grand schemes like this don't always work. And in fact, what happened was, you'll see where the railroad, as it gets into Rockland County, dips down right by Ramapo. And again, the provision in the charter was that this railroad could not connect with any of the railroads that were in New Jersey or in Pennsylvania. However, what would happen is the people coming from Western New York would get off the railroad there, walk a half a mile, and climb back on a railroad that extended up from New York City, a much more direct route down into New York City. And that was one of the reasons why the train that was to go all the way to the Hudson River was never really a success. And while the New York and Erie Railroad continued on for many years as a passageway that would run through Piermont, was ultimately not successful. However, it set the scene for opening up the Hudson River and creating a greater opportunity for commerce, both on the western shore of Rockland, as well as on the eastern shore in Westchester. And just as Rockland County was being transformed into a gateway between New York City and Western New York, a transformative event for the future of the village of Irvington was about to happen on the east side of the Hudson River. In 1846, New York State passed an act to authorize the construction of a railroad from New York to Albany. Now, this railroad, which was being planned for the eastern shore of the Hudson Valley, had been kicked around for many, many years. Interestingly, the already existing owners of the New York Harlem Railroad, which went up through the middle of Westchester, bitterly opposed creating this railway along the Hudson River. It would be obviously a competing railway. It was also a thinking that a railway along the Hudson River could not really compete with the active ferry traffic that went up and down the river, which was the way that most goods and people went up and down the river up to Poughkeepsie and further north. But the river froze a number of months a year, and so looking for a way of creating a railway was a wonderful way of expanding commerce. The following year, the act was amended to establish a procedure for the Hudson River Railroad to survey and acquire property, including a process to adjudicate claims for compensation. And that's a nice way of putting that the legislature passed away, allowing the railroad to basically force homeowners to sell their property right along the river so they could build a track bed. And that led to an increased effort to purchase rights of way along the Hudson River and to start construction of the track bed from New York City to Beacon. And that all began in earnest in July of 1847. One of the very early investors in the Hudson River Railroad Company and a leading proponent for acquiring land to build the railroad was a guy named Fortune White, who was this wealthy investor from New York City. And in 1845, he purchased the remaining sections of the Dutcher farm in what is today Irvington, which was just north of the farm that Justus Dearman had purchased back in 1812. William Dutcher Jr. had died 2 years before, and his executors were kind of anxious to sell off the farm. And the opportunity of the railroad coming in gave them an opportunity to do that. In April of 1847, White became the so-called land commissioner for the construction of the Hudson River Railroad Company, which basically meant that he was the leading proponent for acquiring land up and down the river. And between 1847 and 1849, several landowners, both to the north and the south of the Dearman farm, sold rights to the Hudson River Railroad Company to build a track bed and tracks along the Hudson River. Then after Fortune White sold his rights to his property, which was again the northern part of the Dutcher farm, to the railroad in 1849, he quickly sold his farm to a guy named Jabez Ellis, who was Charles Tiffany's partner. And you'll hear at the end, we're going to be holding another of these presentations to talk about Charles Tiffany in our community as well, but that's for next time. Justus Dearman, however, was a crotchety old 84-year-old farmer who held out, and he refused to sell his property, but he finally relented in I think, May or June of 1849, and conveyed to the Hudson River Railroad Company a strip of land 729 feet long for the price of $700. And by holding out as he did, he got a lot more money than everybody else, both to the north and to the south of him. And if you look at the map, this is a map showing where the track bed will be, and a couple of interesting things about it. You'll see the north is to the right. That's the land of Fortune White, who had bought the northern part of the Dearman farm. To the south, to the left, is the land of John Jewell, who had previously sold parts of the track bed. You'll notice the track bed is actually planned to be built outside, actually on the river. That squiggly line is the high water mark. And so a large part of the tracks originally were planned to be out in the river because that was the most straight way to run the tracks up and down the river. Now, this led to the birth and the growth of this railroad led to a sudden race of developers to purchase up all the old farms along the east shore of the Hudson River. And in late September of 1849, several months after Justus Dearman had finally sold his property to extend the railroad, a guy named Gustavus Saatchi, a real estate broker in New York City, entered into an agreement to purchase the Crosby Farm. The Crosby Farm was located just south of James Hamilton's Nevis estate, which was just below what is the main part of Irvington today. And he had a plan to develop the part of the farm between the Highland Turnpike, or Broadway, and Hudson River into large single home lots. 2 weeks after purchasing the Crosby Farm, Saatchi separately purchased Justus Dearman's 144-acre farm for $26,500. And then later that day, he flipped it. Classic real estate flipping. He sold the Dearman farm for $28,000 to Franklin Field, who was a New York City investor from a wealthy, well-connected family. And the $1,500 that Saatchi earned as a middleman on this transaction would be worth about $50,000 today. So it's a pretty good deal for an afternoon of signing deeds between buying it from Dearman and sending it to Field. Interesting, going back to the Crosby Farm, that's where the Odell Tavern is. And that originally was a plan to build a bunch of single lots along what was to become Clinton Avenue. That was ultimately changed, and there was a plan to create a number of smaller lots, and it was called Abbotsford. And that was going to be a new village besides just the new village of Dearman above it. That didn't happen, although parts of that Abbotsford village can still be seen on East Clinton, just east of Broadway. Okay, so now Franklin Fields owns the old 144-acre Dutcher farm, and he has this grand vision to create a whole new village out of this. And he quickly sought permission from the commissioners of the New York Land Office to erect up to a 350-foot dock into the Hudson River, adjacent to his upland property, for the purpose of promoting the commerce of the state. At that time, the land commissioners of New York State owned all of the property that was under the high water mark in all the rivers, but they could sell that property to an upland or an adjacent landowner if there was a purpose of promoting the commerce of the state. And 3 months later, the New York legislature passed new legislation providing that Hickson Field, Hezekiah Seymour, John Butterworth, George Dearman, and John Jay, as the assignees of the rights and privileges of Benjamin James and James Schultz, to establish the ferry across from Piermont over to the opposite shore, they were declared and constituted a body corporate by the name of the Piermont and Dearman Ferry Company. So if you remember, we talked about a couple of years earlier, Schultz and James had gotten the franchise to hold a ferry going from Piermont over to the shore, and this was now taken over by these 5 guys. And what's really interesting, and this is something that you see a lot in the history of Irvington, these guys were thick as thieves, not in a bad way, but they were all interrelated in many ways. Hicksman Woolman Field, he was Franklin Field's cousin. He was John Jay's brother-in-law. Hezekiah Seymour, he was the general superintendent of the New York and Erie Railroad Company, which had a vested interest in creating a convenient way of getting across from the pier in Piermont over to the eastern shore of Westchester. John Butterworth was John Jay's brother-in-law. He was the son-in-law of someone named Augusta McVicker Jay, who was the sister of Reverend John McVicker. And for those of you who know the history of Irvington, Reverend John McVicker, who we'll talk about in a few minutes, was one of the early folks who came into the village and had a gigantic impact on purchasing the land and creating the Episcopal Church, which today is St. Barnabas. Butterworth was also the director of the New York and Harlem Railroad, which was the competing railroad to the Hudson River Railroad. One of the other investors in this new franchise for this ferry was George Dearman, who was Justus Dearman's son. And he was a purchaser of multiple lots at Dearman. And what I think is interesting there is that, Justus Dearman, who was 84, who sold his property, but it was really largely directed in part by his son, who was interested in getting involved in developing this new community and was part of the group that got this franchise on the ferry. And as we see, he was deeply involved in actually selling lots in what was to become Irvington as well. And the final person was John Jay, who was I think the grand nephew of the Supreme Court Justice John Jay. This John Jay himself was a lawyer, but he was married to Franklin Field's cousin. He was John McVicker's nephew, and he was also a purchaser of multiple lots of Dearman. And so I think what's interesting, and if you study the history of Irvington, you'll see again and again and again, places throughout the village where family relationships and business relationships were key and interconnected people as the village developed. So Franklin Fields in early 1850, with this grand design of taking what had been the Justus Dearman farm and put together this map, outlined a new set of streets to create basically out of whole cloth a village. And if you look at the map on the right-hand side, you'll see that it says Albany Post Road. That is what is today as Broadway. The avenue which runs down the middle, which is 70 feet wide, that is Main Street. You'll see the Croton Aqueduct, which cuts across Main Street, which obviously cuts across our Main Street today. And then a series of streets, and those streets were designated by letters, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and H. Many years later, they'll be named in the streets we know them today, but that was the original configuration of how Dearman was laid out as a new potential village. Now, I love maps. I find maps to be great storytellers. They obviously tell you what a place looked like at the time the map was made, but they often can tell the story behind the map makers. And this map was designed specifically to sell and create a village. And we're going to look at some elements of it that make it really clear. So the first thing I want to look at is, you'll see, if I go back up at the map, in the lower right-hand side, just off Post Road, you'll see a complex of buildings. And this is that portion of it. So right on this says Post Road, that's Broadway. And the period right in the north part of it, that is what is Main Street. And this was Justus Dearman's house. This was his farmhouse, and this was his farmland. And what I think is really interesting, it shows what a farmhouse and a large farm in Westchester at the time was. You can see the shed, the barn, the corn crib, the pig pen, the oven house, the water closet, the well. And it just reflects how this was the one house for a mile north and a mile south, and how his land was laid out. What's interesting is the dwelling house still is in Irvington today. That house is at 130 Main Street, at the very north end of what is Main Street on the south side. It's a gray house that has an Allstate sign in front of it. It's been renovated substantially, so it doesn't quite look like this dwelling house. But the fact that that house still exists here tells a lot about the history of this village. Another thing on the map was they had drawings of types of cottages that could be built on these lots. And these were put in there as examples of what new purchasers of these lots could do to build quaint little cottages. And the two cottages that were shown on the map were taken from Andrew Jackson Downey's book, Cottage Residence, or a series of designs for rural cottage and cottages villages, that had been published several years before. Andrew Jackson Downing was a pioneer in American landscape architecture and design, and he championed a style, and he wrote a series of books that promoted quaint, cottage-like places to build up and down all over Hudson, up the Hudson River. And I don't think he approved of having his designs be put in this map, but that was kind of common. People did that oftentimes and kind of took things from him. You'll see that the map was showed, oops, let me go back if I can. You'll see that the map said at the bottom, estimate the cottage may be built for wood for $830, which at that point was a fairly substantial amount of money, but was a pretty nice cottage for $830. So another thing I want to show you on the map of the new village, this is the map again of the Dearman property was sold, and you'll see that the railroad, the line of the railroad was meant to be actually out in the riverbed itself, some distance from the shore. However, the new map that's been put together by Field, this is the actual Hudson River line at the end of the Dearman property. You'll see that it's all filled in, and where it's filled in is now going to be A Street, which today is Astor Street. And then on the west side of the new railroad track, you'll see that there is a new landfill and a ferry dock there. And so in 1 year, from between 1849, when Justus Dearman sold, to the new map that it was designed by Field to sell this new property, the area on the east side of the track bed had all been filled in, now designated as Street A. It shows a new station house, which was going to be the new station house for the railroad. A railroad bridge had been built at the very north portion of this over to the new landfill on the other side. And the current bridge that's in Irvington today that goes over to Bridge Street, that bridge is actually about 20 feet south of where that railroad bridge is. You can still see the foundations of that original railroad bridge on the north side of the existing bridge. And then on the west side of the train tracks, Field sold most of this dock to the new Piermont and Dearman Ferry Company, which again was owned by John Jay, George Dearman, and several of Field's cousins. And then the map itself indicates that there's going to be an auction of property, and it was going to be done by an auction house called Cole and Chilton, which was a well-known auction house for land down in Merchants Exchange in New York City, which was down by Wall Street. And again, I think the map tells us is that the goal, what Field was looking for was selling this property to new folks in New York City, bringing up everyday middle-class people who wanted to get out of New York City and potentially live up along the Hudson River. New York City at the time was still having repeated cholera epidemics during the summer, emblematic of perhaps what's going on now. And so people often tried to escape the city, and this was a new way for middle-class homeowners, laborers and craftsmen and whatever, to find a new place to come up to the village. And so this was going to be a sale on April 25th, 1850. And this is an advertisement for that sale. This was in the Evening Post on March 26th. And I think you can kind of read this. What's interesting is it notes the distance from the city by train is 45 minutes and that the views are commanding and beautiful. It also says that it highlights the fact that the Piermont Ferry connects with the Erie Railroad, again, highlighting the importance of that new transportation line heading west to being connected to the new Hudson Railroad going up and down the Hudson River and the part of Westchester. It also shows that George Dearman is involved in the proposed sale of lots. And as I said, clearly Justus Dearman's son had planned to be part of the new entrepreneurs that are going to make money out of this new village that was being created out of the old Dearman farm. And what it also says, if you read down, is that you can purchase lots for people willing to build for the summer can purchase at a private sale on very liberal terms on immediate application as above. So they were both going to have a public auction and would allow private sales of lots to go on at the same time. So a number of lots were sold at that April 25th, 1850 auction in Manhattan, and a number of other lots were separately sold during April and May 1850 through private sales. However, perhaps as an indication the sale didn't go quite as well as people might have hoped, 5 days after the initial auction, the auction house Cole and Chilton advertised a second auction of the remaining unsold lots would be held in Dearman on June 11, 1850. And these ads ran for the following month in the Evening Post and several other newspapers in New York, again highlighting that arrangements have been made with the Hudson River Railroad Company for a special train on the day of the sale to leave Chambers Street and to return after the sale was over. The original auction had been down in Manhattan, but they decided to move this next auction up to the property itself as a way of enticing people to think about envisioning themselves there. And the ads also made clear that if a purchaser wanted to build immediately, they could acquire a lot with only 10% down. It's not a lot of money, although it's probably a fair amount of money back then. A number of the lots, especially halfway up the hill, were selling for $230, $250, which meant that for $25 down, you could buy a lot, mortgage the rest, and create a new life for yourself in this new village. And again, it reflects, I think, a classic developer's drive to get people interested in and moving into a new community and starting from scratch. In these advertisements promoting the June sale of lots, Field emphasized Dearman's, and this is going to be called Dearman's originally, central location in terms of transportation. And the ads promoted the fact that the ferry with Piermont affords constant communication between this point and the opposite shore and connects the Hudson River and Erie railroads. Again, I think highlighting the fact that originally conceived much of the push for what would become Irvington was the fact it was well connected to these transportation routes directly across the river that would head west. The ads also suggested that there was a contemplated branch railroad that would run from Dearman to Port Washington over on the Long Island Sound to connect the Erie and New York Haven routes, and that an application was being made for a post office at the station. That branch never happened. That road never happened. You think about today what Westchester would be like, what Irvington would be like if in fact there had been a railroad running from Irvington over to Port Washington, leading into up into Connecticut. But the sale pitch was there. These combined advantages give to the property at Dearman as the point of union between the Great Erie and Hudson routes and the probable point of connection between the Erie Road and those of New England, an actual prospective value in incalculable magnitude. Again, a little hyperbole from the developers, but I think an example of how they were trying to sell and create from whole scratch this village out of empty farmland. Field, even after they held the second auction on June 11th, then Field continued to execute deeds for the sale of individual lots in private sales as well. And interesting, this is a map of the ferry dock and the track, and you'll see that Field in I think it was June of 1850 sold a parcel on the new landfill on the west side of the tracks to Henry Lockwood to build a hotel. And there was a hotel that was called Irvington House that operated there for a number of years. And this area west of the train tracks would soon hold a hotel, a coal depot, and a working ferry dock, and kind of creating the infrastructure needed to build a village. They still had unsold lots, however, so Field scheduled a third auction in July of 1850 to sell the remaining lots. And this is a map of that third auction. It was put together in July. It was supposedly for auction site for lots that had never been offered, being those reserved by the proprietors, but now sold in order to close the interest of the different parties engaged in establishing this beautiful village. Again, perhaps a little hyperbole. I think if you look at the map closely, there's still a number of unsold lots, and they were struggling to get them sold. But this was, again, the way to pitch this out to various folks. And again, this map tells a story. It tells the story of this effort to kind of create a sales environment where people are going to want to buy into this new village. So, interesting, the previous map I showed you, which was from April of 1850, and then this new map from July of 1850, you can see how it characterizes differently the original Dearman farmhouse with its shed and barn and outhouse and pigsty, and the new dwelling house owned by Justus Dearman's son, George Dearman. And it reflects that it's now a dwelling house that is next to a new formed street, and much more an example of a completed type of bucolic village setting, not an old farm setting. This is another section of this new map, and it shows several homes to be built immediately by prominent individuals in combined lots. And again, I think part of what they were trying to do was just demonstrate that various well-to-do people from New York had bought into the community already, and that they were already building cottages, and therefore people who had not yet bought lots should jump on the bandwagon and come up there and sell the lots and purchase the lots. So this is between the southern part of G Street, which is today Grinnell Street, and then you'll see the aqueduct on the right. The top parcels, there were 3 parcels that were sold to Edward Francis Treadwell, who was a well-known lawyer in Wall Street, and indicating that a cottage would be built immediately. And then at the southern part, there's 3 parcels that were sold to Mansell Field, who was Franklin Field's brother, who was already building a beautiful cottage on those lots. And in fact, Field did build a house on those lots, and I'll show it to you in a second. This new map also, again, depicted pictures of not just cottages that you could build, but supposedly cottages that were being built. And again, these were taken from designs done by Andrew Jackson Downing, from another book he had written showing kind of bucolic settings for cottages in the suburbs of outer lands of New York. The picture on the left, which is a fairly substantial house, that was what was built on the Mansell Field property. We saw the bottom of that section of the map. The one on the right was going to be built on northern D Street. I don't know if that was actually built or not. But again, it reflected the kind of design to make it very attractive to people who were living in the throes of New York City to think they're gonna be able to come up to this kind of bucolic setting up on Westchester. Now, another story in the map was in the northern section of the map, there were sections that supposedly had been sold to George Dearman and to Justus Dearman, his father, who had originally owned all this property, and that they were supposedly going to build cottages immediately. In fact, neither George Dearman or his father ever actually built cottages on these lots. And again, reflecting perhaps a little hyperbole by the developers trying to press people to believe that cottages were being built right and left when in fact they were not. But again, a way of kind of salesmanship and what the map can tell people. All this being said, however, within 3 years, the village of Dearman takes shape. By 1853, almost all of the original 266 lots had been sold, and a number of the lots had been resold several times. And one thing you see when you look at the land transactions, there were a number of speculators who came in and bought lots and flipped them and sold them again and again and again. And it was a way of kind of creating interest and hedging their bets of whether or not the village was going to be built. Many of the side lots that had been sold by Field, what I mean side lots, along the side streets, they were sold with the restriction that no dwelling house shall at any time be erected on the said premises of less value than $500, about $16,500 in today's dollars. And that no trade or business shall be allowed thereon, which may prove a nuisance to the neighborhood or injurious to the value of the adjoining premises. The newly created village of Dearman now had a regular train service, a post office, a hotel, an active ferry dock, and numerous operating businesses. It also had a public school on Albany Post Road. The school was just south of Main Street on what is today Broadway, about where the deli is at the southern part of the series of brick buildings, right below the auto sale place, Irvington Auto. That was the public school at the time. And in 1853, only 3 years after this village was created, it had 171 students. So you can see that in a very short period of time, the village kind of took shape and began growing rapidly. The But with the growth of this new village, another really important thing was happening in the surrounding areas, and that was that many of the surrounding farms were also sold. A group of developers came in to buy them up and to basically start catering those to some, not just to the everyday laborers who would like to buy the smaller lots in Dearman, but to the larger landowners that were wealthier and were looking for more summer estates. And in 1852, the Reverend John McVicker, who was this conservative Episcopalian clergyman and a professor at Columbia, bought a 24 acres of the old Acker Farm. Remember, the Acker Farm was north of the old Dutcher Farm, located right along the Hudson River and just to the south of Washington Irving's Sunnyside. And he named this new country retreat Inwood. And he was very well known in New York circles. And the fact that he would invest and buy a country retreat in this new area where this new village is being created, I think had a big impact on other people thinking that this was a beautiful place to come and get a country retreat. The same day he bought that 24 acres, he also purchased from Franklin Field the 110 acres of the old Dearman farm that was located on the east side of the Albany Post Road, the east side of Broadway. And that is essentially what the Field Point property is today. So he owned from what today is Broadway all the way out to the Sawmill River, where Field Point is today. And originally, I think McVicker was thinking he would create a college there. That never came to pass, but that had been kind of his vision of what he wanted to do potentially with that property. In early 1852, McVicker wrote to his family, "We will look at what can be done in Dearman. I shall purchase or secure at once ground for a school to be used as, and after a time converted into, a church." Just as McVicker invested in this property, his son, William McVicker, received appointment as a missionary to Dearman and points adjacent. And he was basically to come here and start a new Episcopalian flock, create a new church in and around Dearman. And then Reverend McVicker and his nephew, John Jay, entered into an agreement to give land for the purpose of erecting a suitable church edifice for Christian worship, according to the forms and beliefs of the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States. And both Reverend McVicker and John Jay purchased multiple lots in Dearman. And Jay eventually conveyed 4 of those lots next to the Albany Post Road to be held for the purpose of creating a church and a parish school. Those lots are the basis of what is today is St. Barnabas. And that was the origin of the creation of St. Barnabas along Northern Broadway in Irvington. And so now with McVicker coming up here and with other people, the social elite of New York starts to purchase summer estates along the Hudson. And actually before McVicker, in May of 1850, Hannah H. Thomas, the wife of banker John Thomas, bought a 94 acres of the Acker Farm, extending east from the Albany Post Road, or east from Broadway, just to the north of the old Dutcher Farm that was now at this point owned by Jabaz Ellis. So this part extended from essentially the property of today, that is where Circle Drive and Riverview is. That was this 94 acres that Hannah Thomas bought that was part of the old Acker Farm. And in 1855, John and Hannah Thomas built a 19,660 square foot chateau based on a design by Alexander J. Downing of a lake or river villa. This is a picture of that, and that is Strawberry Hill. Now, Strawberry Hill is actually still in Irvington today. It was actually just recently repurchased after being empty for many, many years. It's just south of Strawberry Lane. If you're going up Broadway, just before you get to the Maxim building, you'll see that there's a Strawberry Lane. And up that lane and to the right still exists this house, which is Strawberry Hill. In addition to the Thomases, in 1852, George Morgan purchased a 25-acre parcel of the older Acker Farm, again, just north of the land that had been bought by the Thomases. Again, located on the east side of Albany Post Road and just north of what is today Strawberry Lane. Morgan was a partner with his cousin, Edwin Dennison Morgan, a banking and trading company. And he became very actively involved in the local affairs of the growing village of Dearman, and was a founder of the Irvington Free Library. He became very close friends with Washington Irving, and for those of you who came to the talk we did beginning of March about Washington Irving, you heard that Morgan was very close to Irving and was there when Irving died, and was friends with Irving's extended family. Two of George Morgan's sons married the sisters of John Pierpont Morgan Sr., and I think it's likely, and I think it's true, that J.P. Morgan was actually born in George Morgan's house in Irvington in 1867. And that house, which Morgan built on his property, which he named Woodcliff, it still stands in Irvington today. This house is still there. Again, it is on the Maxim property just north of Strawberry Lane. If you're going up Broadway and you look up, you'll see a low brick building, and just behind that building is this mansion, which is a beautiful, beautiful mansion. It's a gorgeous place. And again, it's 170 years later, it's still standing. Now, that was just north of the new part of Dearman. Just south of Dearman was the area that had been known as the Jewell Farm. It had been owned by the Jewell family since the Revolutionary War. John Jewell had purchased it from the Commissioners of Forfeiture in 1785. And then after his death, it was left to his son, John Jewell Jr. And he died in 1851. And in 1851, his children divided up his farm and separated up. And this is the map of partition of that farm. And so if you look on the right-hand side, that is Broadway, or the Albany Post Road. At the very top of the map where you see that writing, that is the part of what is then Dearman, or the main part of the village. You'll see the aqueduct, and the wider part of the aqueduct, that is the tunnel that Station Road goes under. And the private road that's shown on the map, that's ultimately what became Station Road. So all of this part was the western half of the Jewell Farm, and in 1851, again, divided into these various parcels and distributed to John Jewell's children, and several of the parcels were sold off. However, within a couple of years, by 1853, a very wealthy silk merchant named Theodore Macamee purchased almost 60 acres of the Jewell Farm overlooking the Hudson River. And this was from the Hudson River almost to the aqueduct. He built Rosedale, a large Italianate villa with commanding views of the river as his summer estate. He was an avid abolitionist, and for many years, the owner of The Independent, a congregational magazine that was strongly anti-slavery. And that was a big theme of a number of people who lived in the village at the time. Interesting, this large house, Rosedale, overlooking the Hudson, remained there until about 1928, when Spiro Park was built, and this house was torn down. Some of the stone of this house was used to build a couple of the houses on Maple Street in Spiro Park, and there's still a house, I think, at 28 Maple Street that has stones from the original Rosedale as part of its foundation. So it's now 1854. The village has been kind of created out of whole cloth. We now have a thriving area along Main Street. These new large estates are being created around the village as well. And a number of those large estate owners decided that out of the great respect for their famous neighbor, Washington Irving, they wanted to rename the village of Dearman and to name it Irvington. And the village itself had not been legally incorporated. That wouldn't happen for another 20 years. But they wanted to respect Irving by calling this new village, I said, Irvington. And George Morgan reached out to Edwin Morgan, his business partner, who also happened to be the president of the Hudson River Railroad Company. And Edwin Morgan agreed to change the name of the train station to Irvington and to list it as Irvington in all the timetables for the Hudson River trains. At the same time, Moses Grinnell, who was Washington Irving's nephew and owned a big piece of property just north of Sunnyside, contacted the U.S. Postmaster General, who agreed to change the name of the Dearman Post Office to Irvington. And as a net effect of that, because the train schedule and the train tracks, the train station and the post office were known as Irvington, the village became known as Irvington. And Irving, in his own way, expressed his regret that the name of his friend, he was a good friend of Dearman, was being displaced. And he wrote this letter to George Morgan in kind of a cryptic way that Irving was doing it. I'm very sorry to find that the dear man is to give way to such a man as myself, who just now hold myself rather cheap. But that's what led to changing the village name from Dearman to Irvington in 1854. So by the middle of the 1860s, the village of Irvington is now well established. In a little over 15 years, the quiet farm of Justus Dearman had become a vibrant village with over 700 inhabitants, several churches, a busy waterfront, and multiple businesses. And this is a map from 1868. There was a series, there's a company called F.W. Bears, which would make atlases of Westchester starting in the mid-1860s, and every 10 years to write new maps. And this was a map done in 1868 that shows what was the central part of now Irvington. And a couple of interesting things on this map. You'll see, again, the roadway on the right, that's Broadway or the Albany Post Road. You'll see Main Avenue or Main Street, that's our Main Street as it is today. You see the aqueduct, which cuts through it, crossing Main Street. And then along the Broadway, the Albany Post Road to the north, you see parsonages and the Episcopalian Church. That is where St. Barnabas was created. And as I said earlier, John Jay and McVicker had planned to purchase various lots and give them, they actually gave them to William McVicker, who was the new led that church, and that then they built the parsonages and the new church. Across Broadway, you'll see that was the location of the Presbyterian Church. The Presbyterian Church in Irvington was originally on the east side of Broadway. In about 10 years later, it purchased the property just north of the Episcopal Church, and the Presbyterian Church moved to the west side of Broadway and sold the existing church building on the east side to the Catholic Church. If you look again on Broadway, south of Main Street, you'll see, just at the very end, you'll see the, it says 239 and 266. Those are two unsold lots. And just north of that, you'll see school. That was the public school in Irvington at the time, the one I mentioned before. And we're going to explore a couple of different things in this map to kind of look at how some of the village had transformed itself from where it had been just now, 10 or 12 years earlier. So on the east side of A Street or Astor Street and north of Main Street, that was the early business center of Irvington. So now if you think about right across from where the old train station is today, the north side of Astor Street, that was the main business strip of Irvington in the mid-1860s. And it had a grocery store, a plumbing and pipe dealer, a grain, flour, and feed supplier, and it had the post office. And this is a detail of the map I just showed you, and you'll see at the corner of Main Street and what is Astor Place, a building which says C.A. Adams next to it. C.A. Adams was Charles A. Adams, who bought that northeast corner lots in 1857 and built a brick store that he ran as a grocery. Adams was kind of this well-known person in the village, and he continued to live in Irvington for over 60 years, during which he owned several businesses and was ultimately elected as the village tax collector. And at the time of his death in 1923, he was Irvington's oldest resident. And this section of Irvington was, as I said, kind of the center of business life, right across from the depot, right across from the ferry dock, and was where people congregated for their business interests. And this is a picture taken of that corner. This picture was taken probably in about 1863 or 64. And this is you'll see on the right, that's the brick building that C.A. Adams, his grocery store that he built on the corner of Main Street and North Astor. And standing in the doorway of that The guy who has got the vest just to the left of the doorway, that's Charles Adam. See, next to it is the William Barnes painting store. And then next to that is the post office and news depot. And then next to that is a furniture and baggage express for people coming on the train, coming across in the ferry, and the like. And so this was the kind of center of business at the time in Irvington. Another detail of the map from 1868, which I showed you, this is a parcel between North F Street, which is today Ferris, and the aqueduct. That straight line, the squiggly line, that's the aqueduct. Where it says Avenue, that's Main Street. And then the street on the left, that is North Ferris Street. And this whole property, that whole section of what's today Irvington, was purchased by Alfred Stebbins in the early 1860s. And he built and created a private school on the corner of Ferris and Main Street. You'll see it says Academy there. He was a graduate of Amherst College and had taught for many years in private schools in New York, Massachusetts, and Michigan. And for about 5 years, he taught at this private school in Irvington. And he eventually left Irvington in 1865 to travel to Europe for several years. Not long after that, however, that parcel on the northeast corner of Ferris and Main Street was purchased by John Williams and Frederick Guteau on behalf of what they had established as the Mental and Moral Improvement Society of Irvington, New York. And at that site, they established the Athenaeum, one of the first circulating libraries in Westchester. John Williams was a very wealthy landowner. He was at that time the owner of Strawberry Hill, the 94-acre estate that extended east of North Broadway. And Guteau owned a large estate in a beautiful home along South Broadway, again on the east side of Broadway, just a little bit north of Harriman today. And the two of them created this Mental and Moral Improvement Society to basically create this free lending library for folks in Irvington. And it operated that way for many years. And in 1892, the trustees of the Mental and Moral Improvement Society donated that land to the village on the condition that the village continue and maintain upon said premises a free reading room and library. And you think about it today, that is exactly where Town Hall was built later by the village. It was built around 1902 or 1903. And because of this requirement in this 1892 deed, in Town Hall, the village continues to maintain the Tiffany Reading Room. You walk into Village Hall, it's right on the left, which again is a free reading room made available to the public. It's part of the Irvington Public Library. For many years, the public library was actually situated in Town Hall until it was moved down to the Berman building at the south part of Main Street, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago. But that room allows for anybody to go in there and read as part of the legacy of the Mental and Moral Improvement Society of Irvington. Another place I want to point out in the 1868 map is at the very northern end of Main Street and what is today Broadway. And this little section, again, the vertical street, that is Albany Post Road or Broadway. And the street along the bottom is Main Street. And you'll see again, the Episcopal Church is shown there with the parsonages. And then right on the corner, there's 3 buildings, and that's where the Lambros service station is today. But those buildings were built there in the early 1850s. George Dearman, Justus Dearman's son, had purchased that lot on the northwest corner of Main Street and the Albany Post Road or Broadway. And he opened a grocery to compete with the grocery that Adams was running further down the hill. After Dearman died in early 1855, they sold it to his wife, Euphema, sold it to a guy named John Banta, who was a carpenter who had lived on B Street, who purchased the property and took over the grocery store. And then in 1864, he sold this property and his business to a guy named John Dinkle. And this corner became known as the Dinkle Buildings and was run as the Dinkle Store for many years. Dinkle eventually moved to Terrytown, but a grocery store continued to operate on that corner of Main Street and Broadway for many, many years, to the early 1915 or so. Dankel was also kind of a well-known, longstanding person in the community. He was one of the founders of the Irvington Fire Department in 1880. And just the way Adams was at the southern part of Main Street, people who came into the village early on became active business people, established as business, continued to live in the life of the village and have a big impact in the village for many, many years. So I have been talking for perhaps too long, and I think we're going to kind of perhaps open up for questions in a minute. But one thing I wanted to say is 170 years later, after all these events, our community remains strong, and remains strong even in these challenging times of social distancing and the staying at home. But it does because of work by people in the community that I just wanted to call out quickly before we end our talk. Most of you probably know this, but maybe not everybody. But from the minute this COVID pandemic hit, Irvington Rec has created a food delivery system for seniors, where they every week deliver food to seniors in our community who are not able to get out by themselves. And it is something that we should all be supporting and congratulating the staff of the Irvington Rec Center who have continued to do this through and put themselves at risk of doing that. Another thing that I want to call out is the Irvington Volunteer Ambulance Corps, which operates and has done so throughout this pandemic. And Irvington Volunteer Ambulance Corps is a separate private corp entity. It is not funded by the village. It is something that, again, depends upon contributions. And I would encourage anybody who's looking for places to contribute at this time to consider contributing to the Irvington Rec, food delivery, and or to the Irvington Volunteer Ambulance Corps. And I also want to call out quickly the essential workers who work so hard for all of us, the village staff who've been keeping our village strong and vibrant. And it's really, really important to do. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to open this up for questions, and everybody is muted, but the way you can ask questions, if you go to your bottom of your screen, you will see that there is a button, you should be able to see it, that says participants. If you click on that button, participants, over in the right-hand side, you will see says you can raise your hand. And if you click that button, if you have a question, raise your hand, I will see it and I can unmute you and you can ask your question. So I don't know if anybody has any questions, but I'm more than pleased to field any of them if people are interested in doing it. I don't see anybody doing that now. Oh, actually, I do see people raising their hands. Let me, I'm gonna first start with Ruth Cohen. Let's see if I can, Ruth, you're, let's see if I can do it. Whoops. For some reason I'm not able to unmute you. Ruth, why don't you, I think you can unmute yourself, Ruth. So why don't you unmute yourself and you can ask your question. Can you do that? Best laid plans.
Now it's working.
Okay.
Okay. I had two questions for you, Chet. The first one was about the railroad. When did it actually start running trains? And, and there's a second part to that question. And initially, were those trains really able to get into Manhattan in 48 minutes?
Well, so I'll say the trains started running not all the way to Albany, but I believe in 1849 they were running trains halfway up the river. Whether or not the trains could get into Manhattan in 48 minutes or not, I've seen train schedules that from that time period. There was the train to Irvington was a local train, and there were express trains from Tarrytown that were much faster. And I haven't confirmed that they could, but I think they were pretty quick. And so probably under an hour, and that really gave, again, it allowed Irvington to become kind of a commuting village, which was kind of what led to all these people to be comfortable coming up here and then commuting back into the city.
I
Okay.
have a second question about Hannah Thomas.
Okay.
Very unusual for a woman to have enough money to buy a parcel of land in those days. Do you know anything about her?
Well, I think, in fact, you'll see that there's a lot of situations where couples, sometimes the land would be purchased in the wife's name and not in the husband's name, or it would be purchased in the husband's name and conveyed to the wife's name. And I don't really know why they did that, why Hannah and her husband John did it. He was a very wealthy banker. I suspect that for most people, most of their wealth was in their property, and bankers and a number of people were concerned about creditors. And so they would often put the land in the name of their spouses to protect themselves. And you see that again and again with a lot of the properties here in Irvington. Also, land rights at the time, both were very restricted for wives, and wives had certain dower rights, which no longer exist. So you'll often see that there were distinctions made between owning property in a wife's name, because that very much limited what creditors could get at if they were going to go get at a husband's assets and stuff like that. So I don't, why it happened, why they decided to do that, I don't know specifically, but I think that may be probably why. So Ann, I see you're up. Ann Jaffe. Ann, I just unmuted you. You have a question?
Oh, thank you so much. And first, let me just tell you, this was absolutely fascinating and really illuminates for me what I love most about Irvington. But I want to thank you first, really quickly, for your last plug for our Irvington Rec Department's delivery of food to seniors and the Irvington Volunteer Ambulance Corps. Thank you for making that plug. Really important, especially right now, to tie the past to the present, right? When I first moved to Irvington, I was so fascinated that your presentation gave me the image that Irvington actually, the front door was originally the river. That's what drew me to Irvington, was I could see on the map that this is a community that's always recognized not just the beauty of the river, the importance of the river, and also that it was oriented around the river. And when I first came to Irvington, I heard stories of the ferry that went between here and Piermont. And I wonder if you have any further information about how that ferry died.
I think that part of the problem was, as I said, the grand plans for the Erie Railroad running to Piermont died pretty quickly. And by 1854 or 55, the railroad was not operating normally to Piermont, and instead was stopping up in Ramapo or near Suffern, because it connected up with the New Jersey train. So about 1850, I believe about 1855, the charter for the New York and Erie Railroad was changed, allowing it to connect to railroads in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. And once that happened, that became the passageway. People would change from coming from the west, and they would get on these railroads going straight down into Jersey City, which was a much faster way into New York. And the result of that was the traffic that had been anticipated would end up on the pier at Piermont died off. And so whether that's what killed the ferry between Piermont and Westchester, I don't know, but I suspect that was probably much of what it cost it.
But I did hear from people here in Irvington that they remembered that the ferry was operating up through 1950s
and
or something.
It may well have, and I have not researched the kind of long-term history of the ferry, so I don't know, but that may well be the case. But I think the original design, it was going to become a principal passageway between these different railroads, died off. But the ferry could have continued to operate. I just don't know.
Thank you.
Mark Weintraub, let me see if I can unmute you. I can do that. There you go. Mark, you have a question?
Hi, actually, it's his wife now.
Oh, hi.
We were both curious about the history of Cedar Ridge, which is where we are, and wondering about the development of this area of town.
So I don't remember exactly the time when Cedar Ridge was developed. I just don't know I don't remember off the top of my head. I believe it was in the early 20s. I can send to you a map of Cedar Ridge as it was being developed. It's just not something that I haven't studied carefully and looked at the top of. And so I'm gonna kind of punt on the answer to that and send to you a map, and I may have something more to send you, but I'm don't know sure I can give much insight on it today.
No worries. Thank you. Sorry to put you on the spot.
That's okay. Not a problem. So next is Anne Marie. Anne Marie, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. I want to congratulate you on a fantastic presentation. I loved it.
Thank you.
Anne had a similar question to myself. I recently moved here from Dobbs Ferry, and in Dobbs, all we heard about was the wonderful Dobbs Ferry. And I was wondering, did they run at the same time? Because apparently the Dobbs Ferry went to Piermont also.
So the Dobbs Ferry, what I know about the Dobbs Ferry, it had existed long before the ferry between Piermont and Irvington. I believe the Dobbs Ferry was run by a guy named John Dobbs. That's really what part of the name came from Dobbs Ferry. And I believe it may have started in the late 1700s as a hand oar ferry going back and forth across the river. So again, I don't have it right here at the top of my head, but I can, if you email me, I have information about the history of the Dobbs Ferry, and I'm more than pleased to send it to you. Okay?
I have one more question.
Sure.
The aqueduct. When did that come in?
The aqueduct was built in between maybe 1835 and 1837. And again, it was a process by which the New York City had to come by and purchase property and land up and down to really place the aqueduct. And it caused a lot of bad blood with landowners up and down the Hudson Valley. And there was a lot of fighting over it, I think. But it was, I don't remember the first year it actually started flowing water, but it may have been 1837 or 1838. So it was about 15 years before the establishment of Irvington.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Next is Bill Glovin. Do you have a question?
Hi, Chet. Thank you very much. Can you talk a little about the impact of slavery and the Civil War, if there was any, on the town?
Well, that's a longer, complicated question. And again, there's probably people perhaps still on the phone who know more about that than I do. You know, there's been a lot of very extensive study about slavery in and around Irvington done by Sarah Cox and Kathy Sears. And they've done a wonderful presentation about the history of slavery in the late 1700s and early 1800s. I don't believe they have spent as much time looking at the role of the issue of slavery around the Civil War. I will say this, though. I mentioned that McNamee was an avid abolitionist, and there were a number of people in our community who were part of that abolitionist community, largely, I think, through the Congregational Church. Extent as to how extensive that was or not, that's just not something I've looked at yet. I think one of the things the Historical Society is thinking about doing, it would be to put together a future exhibit about abolitionists in our community during that time period. But that's kind of what I know at this point. I don't know a lot more specifics on that.
Thanks.
Okay?
Yep.
Okay, Joan, you had a question?
Yeah, I have a couple. Actually, my first one is when did Tarrytown steal Sunnyside from?
So I would put it this way: whether they stole it. If you came to my Washington Irving talk, I suggested that they have kind of surreptitiously in the night founded their village that took up all of Sunnyside. Tarrytown was incorporated in 1870 under a new law that allowed a group of people to decide to create a village. And Irvington was not incorporated until 1872, 2 years later. And when Tarrytown was incorporated, they filed a map that included the new village of Tarrytown, all of the area that reached down to Sunnyside Lane. Even though, as I told you in my original Irvington talk, much of that area where Sunnyside was, up to kind of where the Honda station is, much of that was thought of as being Irvington at the time.
Yes, Sam.
But so, You have another question, Joan?
Yeah, a comment and a question. The aqueduct, I believe, was built between 1837 and 1842.
Okay.
And the other gentleman wants to know more about the Civil War or Underground Railroad. There's a book written by Eric Foner called Underground Railroad. It hasn't been written too long ago, and that might give him an interesting perspective on what was going on around here also.
Great. Okay.
But I also want to thank you. This was wonderful, very and very much appreciated.
Well, thanks, Joan, and thanks to everybody. You know, it's if people have more questions, you're free to email me, and I can answer them as best I can. But it's a beautiful day outside, and I suggest we all get off this Zoom call and go out and enjoy the day with social distancing, of course.
Oh,
but I want to thank everybody for joining us for this and making this such a nice thing. So
I had a question.
oh, excuse me. Okay, go ahead.
Can I do one more question?
Sure.
Okay. Well, in your early comments about the railroad, the name Vanderbilt never came up, and he was such an important factor, I thought, in the development of railroads up the Hudson corridor there. And of course, at the same time, there was no. You didn't mention how adamant Washington Irving was about having that ugly train go between his home, his lovely nook, and the river. I thought you might have a comment about.
So you're correct that Washington Irving was outraged that his bucolic setting of Sunnyside was being taken over by trains going through, and he objected to it in a lot of his writings. He eventually sold his property to allow the railroad, but he complained, and the railroad supposedly told all the engineers to not blow their horn as they passed Sunnyside. It was one of the few places on the river. In terms of Vanderbilt ultimately did come in and had a big role in taking over the railroads in New York State, but it was later. It was like 20 years later. He consolidated the New York Harlem, the New York Hudson, and a lot of the railroads in upstate New York to create the New York and Central Railroad. And he basically controlled all of those railroads, and then which all went down to what is today Grand Central, which Vanderbilt built as his kind of housing in New York for all that stuff. So
Thank you.
Okay. And I see Liana has a question. Liana, let's see if I can unmute you, if I can.
You hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Go ahead.
A question about Tiffany in this area and Matheson Park. Who Matheson was? Do you have any idea?
So again, if you, let me go back. If you see about our next talk, that's a great segue to what our next talk's going to be. We're going to give a talk in another month that's going to tell the history of Tiffany and Matheson. And for those of you, I'll give you a little tidbit of it. The area just north of the downtown part of Irvington, which is today referred to as Matheson Park, much of that was purchased by Charles L. Tiffany in either late 1860s or early 1870s. I don't remember exactly when. And he owned between a big parcel of that property between Broadway and the Hudson River, and for a number of years. And his family, Louis Comfort Tiffany, his son grew up there, and that's what brought a lot of connections between Tiffany and this area and Tiffany and Irvington. That parcel, that big parcel, was then sold to the Matheson family, and they own that property for the next 60 years or so. Both Tiffany and the Matheson family, and this is something we're going to talk about in our next talk, were very gracious to what they brought to our community, and there's marks that have been left by both Tiffany, the Tiffany family, and the Matheson family in what's in our community. But that is our next talk, which will be on June 14th at 2 p.m. We're going to do it as a Zoom call as well. And so if you've enjoyed this talk, just watch out for that, and we'll go and sign up for that as well.
Great, thank you.
Okay, I think we're going to probably end it here. But again, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I hope it was interesting. If the people have other questions, feel free to email me and I'll answer them as I can. And again, there were a couple of you who raised questions which I couldn't answer off the top of my head, but please feel free to email me directly and I will do my best to respond to them. And I don't know if Pat, you wanted to say a final word?
Just very quickly, Chet, thank you so much. This was terrific. A great venture. I would never have had the courage to try and pull this off, but just from the response that we've gotten, I can see that it's a huge benefit to the community and to our membership. So thank you very much.
Good. Well, thank you, everybody. I will look forward to all speaking to you by Zoom soon. Thanks.
Thanks, Jen.